Hello, guys. We'll be starting our topic today, and the topic is on physical and chemical properties of crude oil. But we are going to start with the physical properties first. So, when we talk about properties of crude oil, we have the chemical and then the physical. So, the chemical aspect deals with the functional group of the petroleum, which is it can be grouped into paraffins, naphthens, aromatic, and then resins. The chemical goes more into the bonds that are inside the crude oil. And then when we come to the physical properties tells you certain things about the properties that we can use to identify the crude oil. An example is the viscosity. So with the viscosity, you can determine whether an oil is heavy or is light. Another thing is also the density, the boiling point, the flash point, the fire point. So today we are going to dwell basically on the physical properties of crude oil. My name is Setopon, and then I'll be your facilitator for today. So without further ado, let's start. So the first one we'll be talking about is the API gravity. So the API gravity tells you how heavy or how light your crude oil is. So API gravity of petroleum is a measure of the density of the stream. The unit of API gravity is API degree, and then it can be calculated from the specific gravity using the following formula. That's API is equals to 141.5 over specific gravity minus 131.5. And then the specific gravity of a substance can also be calculated as the weight of the compound over water. So with this formula, you can determine the specific gravity of any crude oil at all that you find in the market. So the higher the API gravity, the lighter your crude oil products. As you can see from this slide, an API gravity which is greater than 38 means that the crude oil is very light. And then an API gravity which is less than 8.5, it means that the crude oil is very heavy. So this is how we determine whether a crude oil is a heavy crude oil or it is a light crude oil. Now we go to this diagram. This diagram shows you a graphical representation of how the API gravity affects how light or heavy your crude oil is. So in this place, we can see that an API gravity of 0 to 10, we have extra heavy bitumen. And you can come here, we have an API gravity of 90, and we have the LNG and then CNGs. So it means that the higher the API gravity, the lighter your product becomes. The next property we'll be talking about is the color. So the color is also used to identify how heavy or light your crude oil is. A crude oil which is very light will have the light brown color, and a crude oil which is very heavy will have dark color. As you can see in the picture, we have light crude oil. They are normally yellowish brown, and then they begin getting darker and darker. And then you can see this heavy crude oil or sour crude oil, they are very black in nature. So with this, you can determine how heavy or light a crude oil is by just looking at it. Then next we go to the sulfur content. So the sulfur determines whether the crude oil is a sweet crude or is a sour crude. What we mean by a sweet crude is a crude which contains less amounts of sulfur, and a sour crude is a crude that contains heavy or a lot of sulfur. And normally the sour crude are normally found in um, heavy crude oil or very heavy crude oil or crude oil which is very thick. And then the sweet crude, they are normally found in crude oil which are very light. So the API graph, the sulfur content will determine how light or heavy your crude oil actually is. So the sulfur content is expressed as a percentage sulfur by weight and varies from less than 0.1 to greater than 5%. Typically, crude oil with high sulfur content that is greater than 1 are normally termed as sour crude. So you can see sour crude and crude oil, which has a high sulfur content. And on the other hand, crude oil with low sulfur content, that's less than 1%, is normally termed as sweet crude. So the process of removing um, sulfur from crude oil is known as sweetening, which we'll be talking about it extensively in the subsequent part of our class. So here, what you should know is that crude oil with high sulfur content is known as sour crude, and then crude oil with low sulfur content is known as the sweet crude. And this is also a method of classifying or identifying crude oil. So the next one we are going to talk about is the viscosity. So what is viscosity? Viscosity is the measure of the shear strength of a liquid. So a crude oil which is very viscous indicates that a crude oil is heavy. And a crude oil which is less viscous, it also indicates that a crude oil is light. So this viscosity also plays a very heavy role in determining the type of crude oil. So this is therefore the measure of the ease at which the fluid flow, that is talking about the viscosity. So for a crude oil, viscosity depends on the amount of gas dissolved in the oil at any given temperature or pressure. The property is useful to know the reason for crude oil tranships and pipe passing. So let's say if you are dealing with a pipeline and then you want to transport crude oil, you should know the viscosity of the crude oil. If the crude oil is very viscous, it will be very difficult to pass through the pipeline. If the crude oil is very light, then the pipeline will be an easier means of transportation. If the crude oil is very heavy, then the shipping, that's through ships, will be another alternative. So the viscosity also helps you to determine all those things. Now we move to the cloud point and then the pour point. Now, before I talk about it, let me give you an illustration. So if you have, let's say, a crude oil, and then you are in a place which is very cold, like let's say Russia, you would notice that as you're using this oil to get to a time, the oil will cease to flow because it's very heavy and it's almost chilled. Because of that effect, what we called the pour point happens to your oil. And then due to that pour point, your oil ceases to flow. So in crude oil, we have something called the pour point and then the cloud point. So the cloud point is the first stage. So in the cloud point, if you are cooling a petroleum product, a cloudy substance will begin to appear. So as you can see in the picture, this is a crude oil product and then it's being cooled. So when this cloud substance begins to form, we term that as the cloud point. So upon further cooling, this cloud substance begins to accumulate and then it becomes solid, and which almost solidifies the crude oil, and then it prevents your crude oil to flow. So at that temperature, the temperature where your crude oil ceases to flow upon heating, upon cooling, that becomes your pour point. So you can see this is the same crude oil at its initial stages was flowing very, very okay. Then as it's being cooled, it approaches its pour point, and then the same crude oil now becomes viscous to the point that it ceases to flow. So this is the effect of the cloud point and then the pour point of crude oil. Next, we'll talk about the ash content. So the ash contents basically determine the amount of remains or metallic substance or residue that are found in the crude oil. You know, crude oil contains a lot of elements. So sometimes there can be residue found in the crude oil. And the residue, the amount of residue in the crude oil will determine whether the crude oil is a good crude oil or a bad crude oil. Let's say you want to buy a crude oil, and then you find out that the crude oil contains about 20% of sand. Obviously, you determine that crude oil as not a very good crude oil. So in the way to determine the amount of substance or the amount of residue or pollutant in crude oil is through the ash content. Sorry. And in the ash content, the crude oil is put into a crucible and then kept in a furnace and then heated. So as it's being heated, the crude oil will evaporate and then it will leave the residue at the bottom. So this residue is being removed and then is being weighed. And then it determines the amount of residue or pollutants that are found in the crude oil. So this test indicates the amount of metallic constituent in the crude oil. It is defined, it's defined as inorganic residue that remains after combustion of the oil in air and specific high temperatures. So that is the ash content. Then we also talk about the flash point and then the fire point. So what is a flash point? So the flash point is the temperature at which vapor rises from the surface to heat the oil. Sorry. So basically the flash point talks about the temperature at which the first flash will occur when your crude oil is heated and then it comes to a source of ignition. And then the flash fire point is the temperature at which this crude oil will catch fire. So one will ask, what is the importance of this flash point and then fire point? So the flash point determines how flammable a petroleum product is. You might have noticed if you go to a filling station, they write highly flammable. So what does it mean? It means that that substance can easily catch fire. So the flash point and then the fire point will determine how flammable the product will be. So the flash point, in the flash point, at that temperature, your product will just catch a flash, as you can see in the first picture. This flash will come and immediately the fire or the ignition will go off. But in the fire point, there is continuous burn even after the flash has occurred. So that is the difference between the flash point and then the fire point. And then it helps you to determine how flammable your products or your crude oil is. So on that note, we'll end here for today, and then we'll talk about it more in our online class. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask during our online class. Thank you very much.